The night air hung heavy over the Arizona plains, the kind of silence that carried more warning than peace. Coyotes yipped far out in the canyons, and the wind whispered across the dry grass like something alive. Inside the small ranch house, a faint lantern glow flickered against the wooden walls, lighting up a boy's face streaked with dust and worry. He was barely 10, yet the fear in his eyes carried a weight no child should bear. He stood beside the bed where his father lay, blood staining the white sheet, breathing shallow and slow. The ranch had been attacked before sundown. Nobody saw it coming. His father had been a strong man, the kind who worked from dawn till dusk without complaint, who taught his son to ride before he could walk and to shoot straight, even when his hands trembled. But tonight, the man who once faced wild horses and ruthless raiders lay broken and pale. The boy pressed a damp cloth against the wound, whispering to himself like a prayer. "You're not going anywhere," he said softly, his voice shaking. "You're gonna see the sun again." Outside, the world was quiet except for the creak of the stable door and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The attackers had taken what they could: food, rifles, horses, and left behind the scent of smoke and gunpowder. The boy's mother had died years earlier, and the ranch hands who once worked these lands were gone. Now it was just him, his wounded father, and the empty stretch of desert. He didn't know who those men were, but he knew one thing: they had crossed a line. When the sound of a horse returned hours later, the boy's heart stopped. He blew out the lantern and crouched near the window, his small hands trembling as he held his father's revolver. A shadow moved near the corral. Then another. His finger tightened on the trigger. But instead of the rough laughter of outlaws, a low chant drifted through the air, soft, deep, and rhythmic. It was a sound he'd heard only once before, years ago, when an Apache elder had come to trade horses with his father. He remembered the man's words that day: "You protect one of ours, and we protect yours." His father had once given water and shelter to a wounded Apache scout, saving his life when the army was hunting his people. The boy had thought little of it then, but now as the chant grew nearer, a spark of hope flickered through his chest. He ran to the door, opened it just enough to peer through, and saw a rider emerge from the darkness. The man wore a long feathered band around his hair, his eyes sharp as flint. Behind him more figures appeared, silent, watchful, carrying spears and rifles that gleamed faintly under the moon. The boy's breath caught. He knew these were not enemies. These were the Apaches his father had once helped. The leader dismounted and stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the dirt. The boy came out holding the revolver close to his chest. The warrior looked at him for a long moment, then at the wounded man inside the house. His voice was quiet but carried power. "He still breathes?" The boy nodded. "They hurt him bad," he said. "They took our horses, our food. I don't know if he'll make it till morning." The Apache's eyes narrowed. "Who did this?" "Men from the town," the boy whispered. "They said my father was helping Indians. They called him a traitor." A long silence followed. Then the warrior turned his face toward the horizon, where the faint glow of campfires flickered miles away. "We remember his kindness," he said. "He gave water to our wounded when no one else would. The desert remembers. We will help." Inside the house, the father stirred weakly, trying to speak, but his words came out broken. The boy ran to his side, pressing his small hand against his father's rough palm. "They're here," he said. "The Apaches. You're gonna be safe now." The man's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. A faint smile touched his cracked lips. "Take care of this land," he whispered. "It's all we have." The boy didn't know that by dawn. This land would become a battlefield. All through the night, the Apache warriors moved quietly across the hills, setting up signals and watching the ridge lines. They moved with the precision of hunters, their presence unseen yet felt everywhere. The boy sat beside his father, half awake, the sound of distant drums rolling faintly through the wind. He could sense the weight of what was coming. The Apaches were preparing for something far greater than vengeance. They were preparing to defend honor. He went outside near sunrise, drawn by the red light spreading across the sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and smoke. When he looked toward the distant ridge, his breath caught. There were riders, hundreds of them. Apache warriors, their silhouettes sharp against the morning glow. Horses lined in perfect formation, feathers glinting, rifles resting across their saddles. The sun rose behind them like a fiery crown. The boy's heart pounded as he whispered to himself, "They came." A single warrior rode down from the ridge, the same leader who had spoken to him during the night. His voice was steady as he pointed toward the valley below. "The men who hurt your father ride again. They bring soldiers with them." The boy froze. He had thought the worst was over, but now he saw the dust clouds rising far off in the distance, dozens of riders approaching fast. The Apache turned to his warriors and lifted his hand. In a moment, the silence broke into thunder. Horses neighed, rifles were cocked, and the sound of war cries echoed across the land. The boy ran to his father's side. The man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "Stay inside," he murmured weakly, "no matter what happens." But the boy couldn't. Something inside him refused to hide. He looked out through the cracked window, his small face set in determination. He remembered the cruelty of the men who had done this. He remembered the fear in his father's eyes and the promise of the Apache chief. His voice came out barely above a whisper, yet filled with fire. "Don't touch my father." Outside, the first gunshot rang through the dawn. The boy flinched, clutching his father's revolver. Dust filled the air as the outlaws and soldiers stormed toward the ranch, not realizing what waited for them. The Apaches had encircled the land like a tightening ring. From every ridge and gully, they rose. Warriors painted for battle, their cries blending with the roar of the wind. The boy stepped out onto the porch, just as the horizon blazed gold with sunrise. The ground trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. He had never seen anything like it. 400 Apache riders surrounding the ranch from every direction, their banners whipping through the air, their voices like thunder rolling through the valley. The outlaws' confidence turned to terror as they saw the sheer number of riders closing in. The leader of the raiders tried to shout orders, but his words were lost in the chaos. Within seconds, the Apaches had cut off every escape route. Arrows whistled through the air, horses screamed, and the earth shook under the weight of battle. The boy stood frozen, the revolver shaking in his hand, watching the impossible unfold before him. He didn't fully understand the bond between his father and these warriors, but he knew this was no ordinary fight. This was a reckoning born of loyalty, courage, and blood. Smoke from burning brush curled into the brightening sky as the sound of rifles echoed across the valley. The boy backed toward the doorway, his breath coming fast, the world spinning with noise and dust. In that storm of fury and fire, he saw the Apache leader ride past, his expression fierce yet calm, like a man fulfilling an old promise. The boy whispered again, this time to himself, his voice trembling but steady. "They came for us." And as the first light of day broke over the mountains, the fate of the ranch, and everyone on it, hung in the balance. The morning sun climbed higher, spreading its light over the blood-red soil and the endless stretch of land. The wind carried the sound of horses, gunfire, and the distant cry of hawks circling above. Smoke drifted from the burnt corral, twisting through the pale sky like a ghost of what once was peace. Inside the ranch house, the boy crouched beside his father, trying to stop the bleeding while the walls trembled from the thunder of hooves outside. The world that once smelled of hay and coffee now smelled of gunpowder and fear. He pressed a cloth to the wound again, whispering, "Hold on, they're here for you." His father's eyes fluttered open, glazed but aware. "You shouldn't be in here, son," he murmured, his breath faint. "If they take the ranch, don't fight them. Just survive." But the boy's jaw tightened. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about the words he'd whispered before sunrise, about the promise he had made to himself. Outside, the Apaches rode like a wave breaking across the valley. Their movements were silent but deadly, years of desert life turning them into shadows on horseback. They weren't fighting for revenge alone. They were fighting for respect, for a man who had once defied hatred and helped one of their own. Their leader, tall and calm, gave hand signals more than words. He remembered that day when the white rancher had lifted a dying warrior onto his own horse, sharing water while soldiers chased behind. That act had not been forgotten. The outlaws and soldiers who had come for blood were not expecting this. They had believed the desert was theirs to command, that fear would bend any man. But they had stumbled into something ancient, a bond stronger than laws or borders. When they saw the ridges filled with riders and the sunlight flashing on hundreds of rifle barrels, their courage faltered. Inside, the boy tried to steady his shaking hands. He thought about how things used to be before the hate began. Back then, the ranch was full of laughter. His father would come in from the fields, toss his hat on the hook, and say, "One day, all this will be yours." The boy never wanted riches. He wanted peace, the kind that came from hearing crickets by the fence and knowing the world outside was quiet. But peace was a fragile thing on these lands. The whispers started months ago, when folks in town accused his father of trading with Indians. They called him a sympathizer, a fool who didn't know which side he was on. The truth was, his father had grown up on the frontier when kindness was rare and cruelty easy. He had seen children starve and men die of thirst. To him, color or tribe didn't matter. He used to say, "A man dying of thirst doesn't care whose hand gives him water." But not everyone shared that belief. The settlers around thought helping the Apache was betrayal. They feared what they didn't understand. So they came one night with fire and hatred, dragging everything peaceful into ruin. The boy remembered the moment before the gunfire. He had been outside feeding the chickens when he saw the riders coming. Their faces were covered with scarves, their voices loud and cruel. His father had stepped out to reason with them, to calm things down, but the leader had spit at his feet and called him a traitor. The boy never forgot the way the world went silent for a second before the first shot. He still heard that silence in his dreams. Now, as bullets cracked outside, he could feel that same quiet creeping back, heavy and cold. He knew nothing would ever be the same. He looked through the broken window again and saw the Apache warriors closing in, their movements precise, their eyes full of purpose. They were not attacking yet, they were surrounding, waiting. The leader rode to the porch and called out, "Keep him safe." His voice carried across the yard like thunder. The boy nodded, clutching his father's revolver tighter. Through the chaos, a memory surfaced. He remembered when he was younger, how his father used to take him to the nearby hills to learn about tracking. They would follow prints in the sand, listen to the wind, and his father would say, "The land speaks, but only if you listen." Back then, the boy didn't understand what he meant. But now, in the echo of battle, he understood. The land was speaking now. It spoke through the Apache drums, through the whinny of frightened horses, through the cry of a child who had lost too much too soon. The Apaches fought not out of blind rage, but out of something deeper. Among them were men who had seen their families driven from their homes, who had lost brothers to soldiers, who had buried children in the sand. They knew the cost of mercy and the price of betrayal. To them, the wounded rancher was not just a white man. He was a brother who had stood against cruelty, even when it meant turning against his own kind. As the battle raged, the boy crept to the doorway and watched the dust clouds rise like storms. He could see faces, soldiers shouting, horses collapsing, warriors moving like wind through the chaos. The Apache leader rode near the front, his rifle steady, his eyes focused. He wasn't fighting for fame or land. He was fighting for a promise made long ago. The boy's heart pounded as he spotted one of the raiders breaking through the line, heading straight toward the ranch house. He froze for a moment, fear gripping him so tight he couldn't breathe. Then something inside him snapped. He lifted the revolver, aimed as best he could, and fired. The sound echoed through the yard louder than anything he had ever heard. The man fell from his horse, and for the first time, the boy realized what it meant to defend something you loved. He dropped the gun, his hands trembling. His father stirred at the sound, struggling to sit up, but his strength was gone. The boy rushed to him, whispering, "It's all right, I stopped him." His father looked at him with weak eyes filled with pride and pain. "You did what you had to," he said softly. "But promise me this, you'll never let hate grow in your heart." The boy wanted to promise, but outside he could still hear the screams and gunfire. How could he promise peace in a world that knew only war? The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace. The smell of dust and smoke mixed with the sharp tang of sweat and iron. The Apaches held the ridges, keeping the attackers pinned below, but the soldiers had brought reinforcements. The boy could see the flags waving far in the distance, more riders, more guns. The Apache leader saw them too. His eyes narrowed. He knew they couldn't fight forever. Inside, the boy's father tried to speak again. His voice was barely a whisper. "If I don't make it, tell them I was never their enemy." The boy gripped his hand. "You're not going anywhere," he said again, though his voice broke halfway through. The Apache chief entered the house quietly, removing his hat as he stepped in. His presence filled the small room with calm authority. "He fought with honor," he said. "We will not let him fall alone." He knelt beside the wounded man and placed a small leather charm on his chest, a symbol of brotherhood. The boy watched silently, not understanding the words but feeling the weight of the moment. Outside, the gunfire began to fade. Both sides were weary, the desert swallowing sound and breath alike. The Apache warriors regrouped near the hills, readying for what would come next. The chief turned to the boy. "When the sun falls again, the soldiers will return. You must be ready." The boy looked out at the endless land where his home had once stood proud and peaceful. The fences were broken, the barn burned, but the spirit of the place remained. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this fight wasn't over. He could see it in the chief's eyes, in the way the wind carried the scent of dust and fire. That night, as darkness fell, the boy sat beside his father's bed, staring at the flicker of the dying lantern. The world outside was quiet again, too quiet. The stars stretched wide across the desert sky, and far out in the distance the faint echo of drums returned, soft and steady like a heartbeat. He didn't know what the next day would bring. Maybe peace, maybe more blood. But he knew one thing. The promise his father made years ago had changed everything. One act of kindness had brought an army to their door, and one whispered warning had summoned 400 warriors who stood between them and death. As the firelight faded, the boy pressed his hand over his father's and whispered, "I'll protect you. I'll protect everything you stood for." And outside, beyond the hills, the drums grew louder again, warning that the night was not yet over. The desert was still waiting for its reckoning. The next day dawned heavy with the scent of dust and ash. The smoke from the burned corral still curled faintly into the pale morning, and the ground around the ranch was scarred by hoofprints and shell casings. The Apache warriors stood on the ridges, silent and watchful. They hadn't left after the first fight. They were waiting, for they knew what the boy didn't yet understand, that the real battle was coming. The first clash had only been the warning. Inside the house, the boy sat by his father's bed, his eyes red from lack of sleep. The fever had grown worse during the night. He kept changing the cloth on his father's head, whispering prayers he half remembered. Every sound outside made him flinch. The distant cry of a hawk, the creak of the porch boards, even the wind brushing through the broken shutters felt like omens. He could hear the horses outside and the low murmur of the Apache guards speaking in their own language. Their tone was calm, but their faces had the stillness of men who knew the land was about to bleed again. The Apache chief came into the house just after sunrise. He ducked under the low doorway and looked around, his eyes sweeping over the broken furniture, the blood on the floor, the worn face of the dying rancher. "He is strong," the chief said quietly, kneeling beside the bed. "The earth is not done with him yet." The boy looked at him hopefully, but the chief's expression didn't change. "You must go to the spring before midday," he continued. "Bring water from the red rock. It may help him." The boy hesitated. "What if they come back?" The chief looked out toward the ridges where his men stood guard. "They will come," he said, "but not before the sun is high." "We will hold them." The boy glanced once more at his father, then stood up, grabbing a canteen and an old rifle. He didn't know how far the spring was, but he'd been there once, years ago, when the world still felt kind. The path led through a dry wash where lizards darted under stones, and the wind carried the smell of cedar. He walked quickly, his boots crunching against gravel, every shadow making him tighten his grip on the rifle. When he reached the red rock, he saw the spring trickling from beneath it, cool and clear. He filled the canteen carefully, kneeling in the dust. Then he noticed something else, a fresh horseshoe print. His breath caught. Someone had been here recently. He looked up, scanning the ridge, and froze. A figure on horseback was watching him from the hilltop, silhouetted against the sun. It wasn't an Apache. The man wore a wide hat and a military jacket, a rifle resting across his saddle. The boy stood slowly, heart pounding. The rider didn't move for a long moment, then turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. The boy didn't wait. He slung the rifle and ran all the way back to the ranch, his chest burning. When he returned, the Apache guards were already alert, watching the horizon. "Scouts," one of them said. "The army is near." Inside, the chief was speaking quietly with two of his men. Their faces were tense. "They bring more than soldiers," one said. "The settlers ride with them. They want to finish what they started." The chief nodded slowly. "Then we will meet them." The boy stood in the doorway, clutching the canteen. "They're coming back," he said breathlessly. "I saw one of them at the spring." The chief took the water from him and handed it to an older woman who had arrived with the warriors, a healer dressed in buckskin and turquoise. She began tending to the wounded man, murmuring softly as she pressed her hands to his chest. "The spirits of this land are awake," she said. "They have not forgotten kindness." Outside, the Apache warriors were preparing again. Some repaired saddles, others checked their rifles and arrows. The boy walked among them, watching their faces. There was no fear, only determination. He overheard one of them say, "The boy's father saved Lone Hawk. Now Lone Hawk's sons will save him." The boy looked toward the chief then, realizing the truth. The man leading them was the very scout his father had once saved from death. As the hours passed, the heat grew. The sound of drums echoed faintly from the hills where other Apache bands were gathering. The boy sat on the porch, the rifle across his knees, and thought about everything his father had told him about courage and choice. He remembered one line his father always said: "Sometimes doing the right thing makes enemies faster than doing the wrong one." By afternoon, the dust clouds appeared again on the horizon, long, twisting plumes that meant riders were coming fast. The soldiers rode in formation, blue coats glinting under the sun, rifles ready. Behind them came settlers, faces hard with anger, their wagons trailing behind like vultures waiting to pick clean the bones. The Apache chief stood tall at the ridge, his hand raised in silence. His warriors waited like stones, their faces painted red and black. The boy felt the air grow heavy, the same way it did before a storm. Inside, his father stirred, muttering words the boy couldn't make out. He ran to his side, kneeling beside the bed. "They're coming again," he whispered. "The chief says he'll hold them off." His father opened his eyes, struggling to focus. "No more blood," he rasped. "You tell him that." The boy hesitated, torn between fear and duty. "If they come here, they'll kill everyone." His father gripped his hand weakly. "Then you find a way to stop it. You tell him, we don't need another grave on this land." The boy stepped outside, the sunlight blinding him. He found the chief near the corral, tying his horse's reins. "He doesn't want more fighting," the boy said. "He wants peace." The chief looked toward the valley where the soldiers were advancing. His jaw tightened. "Peace cannot come while their boots crush the earth," he said. "They call us enemies because we won't bow. If we run, they will burn your house again. If we fight, they will call it war. There is no peace in the tongue of men who take." The boy looked down, his small hands trembling. "Then what do we do?" The chief looked at him for a long moment, then rested a hand on his shoulder. "We do what your father did. We stand." The wind shifted then, carrying the sound of horses and shouted orders. The boy could see the soldiers forming lines at the foot of the valley, their rifles glittering. He heard the settlers shouting insults, demanding that the savages be driven out. But among them, one voice rose above the rest, a man wearing a black coat and a scar across his cheek. The boy recognized him. He was the one who had shot his father. Rage flared in his chest, hot and sharp. He gripped the rifle so tight his knuckles turned white. The Apache chief noticed and said quietly, "Do not fire until I say." The tension stretched thin as wire. The two sides faced each other across the open plain, the space between them filled with ghosts of the past. For a moment it seemed time itself stopped. The boy could hear nothing but the beating of his own heart. Then the man in the black coat raised his arm and shouted. Gunfire cracked through the valley. The boy ducked as bullets splintered the fence. The Apaches answered in an instant, their rifles roaring from the ridges. Smoke filled the air, the ground shaking beneath the stampede of horses. The boy could hear the screams of men and the whine of bullets slicing past. He crawled toward the stable, desperate to see through the haze. From there he saw the Apache leader charge forward, his horse cutting through the dust like lightning. The chief's rifle fired again and again, his voice rising in a cry that echoed across the hills. The boy had never seen such courage, and for a moment hope burned bright in him. But then he saw something else, a wagon being moved behind the soldiers, its canvas sides hiding something heavy. When one of the soldiers pulled the cover aside, his blood ran cold. It wasn't a supply wagon. It carried a small cannon. The boy ran back to the house, shouting, "They have a cannon! They'll destroy everything." The chief turned sharply, understanding the danger. "Then we move," he said, signaling his men. The sound of hooves thundered again as the Apaches shifted formation. Smoke rolled across the plain, swallowing everything in gray. The boy could barely see, but he could hear the clank of metal as the soldiers loaded the cannon. He ran to his father's bed and whispered, "I'll get you out. I promise." But before he could move him, the cannon fired. The explosion tore through the valley, shaking the ground. The window shattered and the walls groaned. The boy threw himself over his father as dust and debris filled the air. When the sound faded, all he could hear was ringing in his ears. He opened his eyes to see the ceiling cracked, light pouring through the holes. The Apache chief was still outside, shouting orders, his voice hoarse but unbroken. The boy looked at his father's face, pale, motionless, and whispered, "Please, not now." Outside, the sky darkened with smoke. The Apaches were still fighting, the soldiers still advancing. The boy stepped to the doorway, clutching his rifle, his heart full of fire and fear. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the man in the black coat rode forward again, shouting for the boy and his father to be taken alive. The reason was still hidden, Buried beneath secrets the desert itself seemed to guard. The war for the ranch had only just begun. The sky had turned the color of smoke by late afternoon, and the wind carried the scent of burned wood and gunpowder. The boy could barely tell where the clouds ended and the dust began. The cannon fire had stopped for a moment, but the silence that followed felt worse. Every sound, every whisper of the wind made his heart race. The ranch house leaned under the weight of damage, its windows shattered, the roof cracked. Inside, his father lay unconscious, breathing shallowly. The boy sat beside him, hands trembling, trying to keep him alive while the world outside came apart. Through the broken doorway, he could see the Apache warriors regrouping in the distance. They moved quickly and quietly, their horses restless but ready. The chief stood near the corral, his silhouette dark against the rising dust. His calm voice carried through the chaos as he gave orders. The boy couldn't hear the words, but he could feel the purpose in them. The Apaches were not retreating. They were preparing for something bigger, something final. The boy wanted to believe they could win, but deep down he knew how outnumbered they were. More soldiers had arrived from the south, and the settlers with them were armed and angry. They were men who didn't just want to punish, they wanted to erase. The boy pressed a damp cloth to his father's forehead and whispered, "Hold on. Please hold on. You can't leave me yet." His voice broke halfway through. Outside, thunder rumbled, not from the sky, but from the hooves of dozens of horses pounding across the hard ground. He peeked through the shattered window and saw riders moving into position. The Apaches had formed a half circle along the ridge, rifles raised, waiting for the enemy to draw closer. The boy could feel the air itself grow tighter, as if the desert was holding its breath. The Apache chief turned and looked toward the house. Their eyes met for a brief second. It was enough for the boy to understand. The chief wasn't just fighting for land or vengeance. He was fighting for the promise he had made to a dying man years ago, a promise of honor and loyalty. The boy's father had once saved his life, and now he would return that debt no matter the cost. The boy felt something stir inside him. He wasn't a soldier, but he couldn't sit and watch anymore. He checked his father's revolver, making sure it was loaded, then stepped outside. The light was dimming and the world looked strange. Red dust swirling through gold light, shadows stretching long across the valley. He could hear the low hum of drums again, faint but steady, carried by the wind from the Apache camp beyond the hills. One of the Apache warriors stopped him near the porch. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "The chief doesn't want you in the open." But the boy shook his head. "I'm not hiding," he said. "If they reach the house, I'll fight." The warrior studied him for a moment, then handed him a small pouch of bullets. "If you fight, fight for your father's spirit, not for anger," he said. "Anger makes you blind." The boy nodded, gripping the rifle tighter. He took position behind the old water trough, his eyes scanning the open plain. The dust was thicker now, swirling like fog. He could barely see the shapes moving within it. Then he heard the sound of the cannon being wheeled into place again. His stomach twisted. The soldiers were setting up for another shot, this time closer. The Apache chief signaled his men. They spread out, taking cover among the rocks and brush. The horses pawed the ground impatiently, their nostrils flaring. The tension was so thick it felt like the world would crack. Then the cannon fired. The explosion tore through the valley, throwing dirt and smoke into the air. The blast missed the house but struck the corral, splintering the posts and sending debris flying. The boy fell to the ground, ears ringing. When he looked up, the Apache chief was already on horseback, charging forward through the dust with a cry that sent chills down the boy's spine. The warriors followed him, a storm of hooves and fury sweeping across the plain. The soldiers returned fire. The sound of rifles cracked like lightning. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the desert filled with chaos. The boy tried to see through the haze but could only make out flashes, figures rising, falling, the glint of metal, the streak of arrows cutting through the air. He felt helpless watching it unfold, yet something inside him told him this was the moment that would decide everything. He thought of his father's words about standing for what was right, even when it brought enemies. Those words echoed in his mind as he gritted his teeth and steadied the rifle. A rider broke from the smoke, a soldier aiming straight for the ranch house. The boy lifted his rifle and fired. The shot hit the man's shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The boy's hand shook violently, but he loaded another round. He wasn't thinking about fear anymore. He was thinking about survival. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement on the far ridge. More riders, Apaches who had been waiting for the signal, swept down like a dark tide. Their war cries filled the air, echoing through the canyons. The soldiers faltered for a moment, thrown into confusion. The boy could see the Apache leader now, riding at the front, his face streaked with war paint, his rifle raised high. But then over the sound of battle, a new noise cut through. The creak of wagon wheels and the harsh shout of the man in the black coat. The boy's stomach dropped. The man had brought something else. Behind him, several soldiers were hauling barrels off another wagon, barrels marked with crude symbols. He had seen markings like that once before on dynamite used to clear rocks near the mine. The boy's eyes widened. They weren't just trying to drive the Apaches off, they were planning to blow up the entire ranch. He turned toward the house, shouting, "They've got explosives!" But his voice was drowned by the noise. He ran inside, grabbed his father's shoulder and tried to shake him awake. "We have to move. They'll destroy everything." His father's eyes fluttered open for a moment, dazed. Where's the chief?" he whispered. "He's out there," the boy said. "He's fighting." The wounded man struggled to sit up, but his strength was gone. "You tell him." His words faded. "Don't let them take the land." "Not this way," the boy nodded, tears burning his eyes. He ran back outside. The battle had moved closer. The Apache warriors had driven the soldiers toward the wagons, but the man in the black coat stood on top of one, shouting orders and waving his pistol. He looked wild, desperate, like a man possessed. The boy could see the glint of a fuse being lit. Panic surged through him. He sprinted across the yard, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Stop the wagon! It's going to blow!" The Apache chief heard him and turned, immediately understanding. He spurred his horse forward, charging straight toward the wagon. Bullets whizzed past him, tearing through the air, but he didn't stop. He leapt from his horse, landing hard, tackling the man in the black coat just as the fuse sputtered dangerously close to the barrel. The two men struggled, their shouts lost in the roar of battle. The boy could see the fire creeping down the fuse line, sparks jumping closer to the barrel. His heart pounded so loud he could barely think. He dropped his rifle and ran forward, his small body moving through smoke and debris. The chief and the black-coated man rolled on the ground, fists flying. The boy dove for the fuse, his fingers burning as he tried to snuff it out. The heat bit into his skin, but he didn't stop until it died in the dirt. When he looked up, the chief was standing, breathing hard, the other man motionless at his feet. For a brief second, they locked eyes. The chief's expression was both fierce and grateful, but before either could speak, a gunshot cracked from the ridge. The chief staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The boy's scream was lost in the wind. Soldiers were advancing again, and the sound of their boots filled the valley. The boy scrambled to the chief's side. "We have to get you inside," he said, pulling at his arm, but the man shook his head. His eyes were fixed on the hills. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "We hold this ground, for your father, for our people." The boy turned toward the ranch house. The walls were splintering, smoke curling from the roof. He could see his father sitting up now, pale but awake, watching through the window. Their eyes met, father and son, and though no words passed between them, the boy understood what he had to do. He turned back to the battlefield, raising his father's revolver in both hands. The air trembled with the sound of hooves and shouts. The Apache warriors regrouped behind the wounded chief, ready for one last stand. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the blood-streaked land. The boy could feel the world tightening around him, every second stretching thin. He could taste the dust in his mouth, feel the fear and courage tangled in his chest. The next shot, the next breath could decide everything. And as the final light of day slipped behind the mountains, the boy whispered the same words that had started it all, words carried on the wind like a vow. "Don't touch my father." The last light of day faded behind the ridges, turning the desert golden red before the night took it. The sound of battle slowed until only the wind and the groans of wounded horses remained. The boy stood in the middle of the yard, the revolver still heavy in his hands, smoke curling from its barrel. His chest heaved, his ears rang, and the world around him felt hollow and strange. The cannon lay shattered, its wheels broken, the barrels of dynamite scattered harmlessly in the dust. The man in the black coat was gone, swallowed by the chaos he had started. The Apache warriors stood in silence now, their leader still on his feet despite the blood darkening his shoulder. The moon rose behind him, casting his shadow long over the ground. The soldiers who remained had fallen back toward the valley, leaving behind their dead and wounded. Their courage had broken with the fall of their leader and the loss of their firepower. Those who came to destroy the ranch had been forced to retreat by the strength of men they called enemies. The boy lowered his weapon slowly. His hands shook, but he refused to drop it. The chief turned toward him and gave a slow nod. It was a gesture of respect, not just for the courage of a child, but for the bond that had brought them all together. The battle was over, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. The boy ran to the house, stumbling over broken boards and debris. Inside, his father was still alive, but barely. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes opened when he heard his son's voice. "It's over," the boy said, kneeling beside him. "They're gone." The Apache stopped them. His father tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "The ranch?" he managed. The boy looked around at the wreckage, the shattered windows, the smoke-stained walls, the broken table that once held their meals. "It's still here," he said quietly. "It's hurt, but it's still standing." A faint smile touched the man's lips. "Then it's enough." The chief entered the room, leaning slightly from his wound but walking steady. He knelt beside the bed, his dark eyes calm and full of something that felt like sorrow and pride mixed together. "You kept your word," the chief said softly. "You gave help when the world turned its back. Tonight your house stands because of that." The wounded man looked at him with weak gratitude. "We just did what was right," he whispered. The chief placed a hand over his chest, a gesture of respect, then looked at the boy. "Your father's heart is strong, but he will need time. The land has its own way of healing. You must listen to it." The boy nodded, though his eyes filled with tears. He had seen more death in one day than he ever imagined possible. He wanted to believe things would go back to the way they were, but he knew they never could. For the next few days, the Apache warriors remained nearby, guarding the ranch and tending to their wounded. The boy helped where he could, carrying water, fetching supplies, and sitting by his father's side when the nights grew cold. The chief's people buried their fallen in the hills above the valley, marking the graves with small stones and feathers that swayed gently in the wind. The soldiers never returned. The settlers, shaken by what they had seen, spoke no more of revenge. The desert had its own justice that day. As his father's strength began to return, the boy spent his evenings on the porch, watching the sunset burn across the horizon. The land looked different now, scarred yet beautiful in a new way. It was no longer just a ranch. It was a place where courage and kindness had stood against hate. One evening, the chief came to him quietly. The boy stood as he approached. "You fought with heart," the chief said. "Your father gave water once and it saved my life. You gave courage tonight and it saved many more." The boy looked down, unsure what to say. "I was scared," he admitted. "So was I," the chief said with a faint smile. "But fear does not make us weak. It reminds us what we stand to lose." They stood together for a moment, watching the sun dip behind the red hills. The chief untied the leather charm from around his neck, the same kind his healer had placed on the boy's father after the battle. He held it out to the boy. "Keep this," he said. "When the wind grows restless, when the land feels heavy, remember what happened here. Remember that honor binds stronger than blood." The boy took it carefully, feeling the smooth leather against his skin. "Will you come back?" he asked. The chief looked toward the horizon where his warriors waited. "Perhaps," he said. "The land decides when men should meet again." The next morning, the Apache warriors rode out. The boy watched them disappear into the desert mist, their horses leaving trails of dust that glowed in the early light. It felt like watching a chapter of life close forever. Days turned into weeks. The ranch slowly began to heal. The boy rebuilt the fences, repaired the corral, and planted new seeds in the soil. His father, though weakened, managed to walk again with the help of a cane. Together, they worked side by side in the quiet mornings, the way they used to before the world caught fire. Sometimes the boy would ride to the hills and sit near the graves of the Apache warriors. He would leave small tokens there, a feather, a stone, or a bit of wild sage. He didn't understand all their ways, but he knew respect when he felt it. One afternoon, months later, a rider appeared from the south. It was a messenger from the nearest town. He carried letters and news. Among them was one that made the boy's father pause for a long time before opening it. It was a formal letter from the territorial commander. It said the soldiers involved in the attack had been disbanded, and that what happened on the ranch was a misunderstanding of orders. The words were cold, official and empty, but his father smiled faintly after reading it. "They can call it what they like," he said. "The truth doesn't need their permission." That night, the boy sat outside again, watching the stars shimmer across the endless sky. The desert was quiet, except for the soft cry of an owl and the rustle of dry grass in the wind. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the fire, the courage of men who came to defend a single wounded man because of something that happened years before. He looked at the charm the chief had given him, hanging from his neck. It reminded him that goodness had a way of finding its way back, even in a land that knew so much sorrow. His father joined him on the porch, lowering himself carefully into the old wooden chair. For a while they said nothing, just listened to the sound of the night. Finally the boy asked, "Do you think they'll ever come back?" His father looked toward the dark hills, his eyes soft. "Maybe not in the way you think," he said. "But their spirit's still here. It's in the wind, in the way this land breathes. You don't forget people like that. You carry them with you." The boy nodded slowly. The stars above seemed to stretch forever, and for the first time the world didn't feel as broken as before. The pain was still there, but it was quieter now, turning into something he could live with. Seasons passed. The grass grew back where the battle had torn it. The scars on the land faded, though not completely. Every sunrise reminded the boy of that morning when 400 Apache warriors had ridden out of the desert to keep a promise, and every sunset reminded him that kindness could echo longer than hate. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop by the ranch. They would ask about the story, about the day when an army of warriors surrounded the homestead. The boy, now grown, would smile and tell them the same thing his father once said. It wasn't a war. It was a promise kept. When the desert wind howled through the canyons, people said it sounded like distant voices, men on horseback calling across time. The boy, now a man, would close his eyes and listen, knowing those voices were part of the land forever. And every time the wind carried the sound, he'd whisper the words that had started it all, a memory, a vow, and a legacy bound to the soil beneath his feet. "Don't touch my father."